Welcome to our podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages, and to today's episode, Wicked Medieval Women and the Monks Who Loathed Them. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. Joining me to discuss medieval misogyny is the least wicked woman I know, my wife and my inspiration for all things medieval, Ellen.
What was that?
Wicked Woman by Coven, one of the first occult rock bands from their 1969 album, Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. This seemed like the perfect musical introduction for today's episode, given that at least one of our three wicked women was portrayed as a lascivious witch.
Lovely. I don't know how I missed that. But we need to emphasize that wicked is in air quotes. We'll be talking about three noble medieval women from the 10th and 11th centuries. First, an English Queen Ælfthryth,
whom we previously encountered in our episode on the murder of King Edward Martyr.
Second, a late 11th century Norman noblewoman, Mabel of Belleme. And third, her younger contemporary, the French Countess Sibyl, or Sibyl of Porcien.
Just as importantly, we'll be meeting the 12th century monastic chroniclers who loathed these women and who are, at least in part, responsible for their nefarious reputations. They are, respectively, the anonymous author of the Liber Eliensis, a composite cartularian history of the English Abbey of Ely, the highly esteemed Anglo-Norman historian Orderic Vitalis, and Guibert of Nogent, the author of the first autobiography since St. Augustine's Confessions and a historian of the First Crusade. I'm going to begin with a confession. The idea for this episode began with a comment by Ellen asking me why Mabel of Belleme had such a bad reputation. My immediate response was because she had the bad fortune to be trashed by a prominent monastic chronicler. This led me to think about the other two ladies we'll be discussing today and how monastic writers remembered them as wicked women. And because I'm addicted to bad puns...
to which I am mercilessly subjected on a daily basis.
Yeah, right. I thought that an episode called Wicked Medieval Women and the Monks Who Loathed Them would be fun. It would also be simple and educational, and I was partially right. It turned out less simple and easy than I expected. My first thought was that this would be an episode about medieval misogyny, and in part it is. But as Ellen and I began to investigate the subject more, we realized that this was only partially the explanation for why these three women were portrayed as wicked. The portrayal of each had as much to do with the monastic author's own agendas as it did with the women's actual life stories, or even more generally, with misogynistic monastic conceptions of women. This is not to deny that the culture of Western Europe in the high and late Middle Ages was misogynistic. The literature of this period is rife with anti-feminist tropes drawn from three main sources: scripture, patristic writers, and classical philosophy and literature. Aristotle, a philosopher famous for being wrong about everything, which is a witticism made by John Green in one of his Crash Course History episodes, which I assigned to my class, characterized women as imperfect males. They can never achieve full rationality and are by nature designed to be ruled by fathers and husbands. For Aristotle and... I'm just saying what he said, not what I say.
Okay.
For Aristotle and his followers, most notably the physician Galen, the role of the male is dominant even in procreation. Sperm provides the form of the offspring, which is implanted in the material supplied by the female.
I thought that Aristotle was the philosopher who actually thought it was important to examine nature. Didn't he notice children often look like their mothers?
Yeah, he did. But so what? Form is the rational soul. The body is the material in which the form resides. So appearances really don't matter. St. Thomas Aquinas used the Aristotelian conception to explain how and why Jesus could be born of woman without being tainted by original sin. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary was hotly debated by the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The former argued that she herself was born free of original sin, while the latter said that if she were, then she would not have needed the intercession and sacrifice of her Son for salvation. So, St. Thomas, based upon Aristotle, gave the Dominicans a scientific explanation for the paradox that a woman stained by original sin could give birth to a son that was sinless, since God the Father supplied the form and Mary supplied only the material. The Aristotelian idea of conception was previously used by St. Anselm to explain why, if the soul is itself sexless, we speak of God the Father and God the Son rather than God the Mother and God the Daughter. This is because in humans, the male is dominant in procreation.
My brain hurts. Okay. Wow. This really is upsetting.
If that upsets you, this will really get you going. The physiological proof of the biological inferiority of women is that they menstruate. Medieval Christian writers knew from Scripture that menstruating women were unclean and a pollution. The educated clerics knew from their study of Galen that menstruation was evidence of an ineffective bodily system that needed regularly to clear itself of the residual bilge water.
Bilge water?
Yeah, bilge water. Aristotle and Galen provided scientific support for a truth known from Scripture. Adam was created in the image of God. Eve was a secondary creation from the rib of Adam.
But God did create Eve as a wife for Adam, and humanity was conceived through their marriage. So women have a role in divine providence as wife and mother.
True, but several of the patristic fathers accepted this grudgingly. Tertullian
is perhaps the most misogynistic of all the patristic fathers. Okay, never mind. Go ahead.
Yeah. Tertullian and St. Ambrose were vehement. Marriage should be avoided if a man had the spiritual strength to resist his sinful urges. Marriage, at best, is a distraction to a life of devotion to God. In this, they echoed the classical pagan writers who viewed marriage as incompatible with the life of a philosopher, since women by nature are vain, demanding, jealous, fickle, deceitful, and treacherous. St. Paul and the patristic fathers allowed marriage, as it's better to marry than to burn, but maintained that chastity and virginity were the superior state for both men and women. But standing in the way of maintaining this state is women's natural sexual veracity. Just as Eve lured Adam into sin, all women tempt men sexually.
Can you say blame shifting? I guess I shouldn't be surprised that a vehemently celibate clergy blamed women for their own sexual urges.
Denunciations of female sexuality were widespread in Christian writings in the High Middle Ages because of the insistence of the Reformed papacy on clerical celibacy. The medieval Catholic Church, of course, allowed women to participate as nuns, but citing Scripture, canon law limited holy orders to males.
As it does today.
In the early Middle Ages, clerics often were married men. This changed with the so-called Gregorian Reform of the second half of the 11th century. The Gregorian Reform, sponsored and promoted by Pope Leo IX and his successors, most notably Pope Gregory VII, aimed at enhancing the spirituality of clergy and separating them more from the secular world. By the 12th century, clerical marriage had become the sin of Nicolaitism. Priests, like monks, were now to be celibate.
Nevertheless, clerics in lower orders and even priests and deacons often continued to have spouses, but such unions were illicit. This continued throughout the Middle Ages and only changed with the Council of Trent and the Catholic Counter-Reformation of the 16th century. The difference was that rather than wives, these women were now considered concubines. And I'm sure they were blamed for leading the clergy astray.
Yeah. If a priest with a concubine was sinful, A monk with one would have been an abomination, for the vow of celibacy was central to monasticism. The three monastic authors who we will discuss in today's episode all had limited interaction with and knowledge of women. The ranks of Benedictine monks in the 12th century were filled with oblates, children given by their fathers to an abbey as a religious offering. The monastic world required separation of the sexes. Monasteries were masculine societies, as nunneries were female. Contact between monks and women was as infrequent as possible.
So now can we get to our wicked women?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, so let's start with Queen Ælfthryth, since she is the earliest in time. I should begin by saying that the story I'm going to tell is really not about the historical Ælfthryth, who died in the early 11th century. Rather, it's a story that's told about her in a work from the second half of the 12th century, this Liber Eliensis, this cautionary/monastic history of the Abbey of Ely. In the 12th century, English abbeys, intent upon defending their rights to their vast landed properties after the Norman conquest, copied the royal charters they possessed into collections. These collections are called cautionaries. The Norman settlement that followed the Norman conquest was filled with disputes over land, as the estates of native English landowners were confiscated by the crown and redistributed. The new Norman lords interpreted the complexities of Anglo-Saxon lordship and landholding to their benefit, as they gobbled up as much property as they could, not only from defenseless English neighbors, but from other Normans and from the English Church.
I like our friend Robin Fleming's characterization of the Norman settlers as a kleptocracy.
Yeah, they really were.
Yeah.
Monastic lands held on loans were particularly vulnerable to be gobbled up. Because the new Norman rulers claimed to be legitimate successors and maintainers of the laws of King Edward the Confessor, the solution was to prove rightful ownership in shire and hundred courts, and the surest proof of this was a royal charter detailing the grant of that property to the church.
And if they didn't have an original charter for a particular property, they corrected the deficiency by piously forging one. There was actually a popular history book a few years back called God's Forgers.
Yeah, piously, since they just knew that they had rightful possession of the land, and the charter proving it had disappeared over time.
Okay.
These charters were copied into cartularies. Few original charters from the Anglo-Saxon period have survived, which makes these cartularies critical for historians. The 12th century was also a period of historical writing, as Anglo-Norman ecclesiastical authors tried to make sense of the history of their religious houses and how it fit into the larger history of the English and Norman peoples.
And, of course, ultimately divine providence, which is why this is not history as we would think of it.
Yeah. Several English monasteries produced in the 12th century cartulary histories, both to defend their properties and to teach their monks the histories of their house. The Liber Eliensis was one of these. The author-compiler was a monk of Ely writing for his fellow monks in the late 1160s and early 1170s. His identity is unknown, although a couple of candidates have been suggested. In writing the history of the Abbey of Ely, the author focused on two royal women. The first was the 7th century foundress of the Abbey, the East Anglian princess, St. Aelfthryth, the Old English name preserved today as Orderic, and it was also the name that I suggested we call our daughter Rebecca.
Audrey Abel sounds like a character from a DC comic, but it was better than the name you wanted for our son, Scarpedon.
Well, would you have liked Aelfthryth Abels? Okay.
Luckily, those weren't the options.
The second woman was Queen Ælfthryth, and I know Old English names are confusing. Queen Ælfthryth was the wife of King Edgar the Peacemaker, or known sometimes called Peaceable. She was also the mother of King Athelred the Unready, and according to this monastic author, responsible for the murders both of her stepson, King Edward the Martyr, and of Abbot Byrhtnoth of Ely. Here is the story that he tells. One day, while Abbot Byrhtnoth was journeying to the court of King Athelred on behalf of the newly restored Abbey of Ely, he found himself in the New Forest. Having to answer the call of nature, the modest abbot left his retinue on the road and walked into the forest, to find a more private place to relieve himself. By chance, he came upon Queen Ælfthryth, who stood beneath a tree. To his horror, he discovered that she was concocting a magical potion that had the power of transforming her into a mare, a female horse. Okay. And why was she doing this? Well, I'll simply quote the Liber Eliensis. To satisfy the unquenchable intemperance of her seething lust. Running hither and thither, and cavorting with the horses, she indecently exposed herself to them, in contempt of the fear of God and the honor of her royal dignity, and in this way brought reproach upon her good name. End quote.
Ew.
Yes, ew. The abbot rushed away, but not before the queen saw him. Byrhtnoth continued on to the royal court, was received warmly by King Aelfthryth, and successfully carried out the business of his church with dispatch. Being a man of discretion and not wishing to gain the enmity of the powerful queen, he answered a summons to meet her in her hall before departing for Ely. She received him privately, and, much to his shock and distress, tried to seduce him.
Okay.
She reckoned that if she could entice him into breaching his vow of continence, she could guarantee his silence about her magical wrongdoings. But Byrhtnoth, putting up both physical and verbal resistance, refused and shrank back. Her advances spurned. Ælfthryth angrily summoned the serving women of her evil household and ordered them to kill the holy man who might one day expose her iniquity. Realizing that the abbot had to appear to have died of natural causes, she had her serving women stab him under the arms with red-hot daggers. When the abbot fell dead, she and her serving women began to wail, crying out loudly as if in mourning. Her ploy worked.
Wait a minute. Are you telling me that being stabbed in the armpits with red-hot daggers doesn't leave marks or leave blood and doesn't cause a lot of noise?
No, I'm not telling you that. Our monastic author is telling you that.
Okay.
At any rate, the monks assumed that the abbot had died of natural causes, and deeply grieving, they took his body back to Ely for burial.
Okay, but if Ælfthryth managed to kill Byrhtnoth without exposing herself, how does the author know this?
He had the most reliable source possible.
Okay.
Queen Ælfthryth herself. Because she was the king's mother, no one presumed even to mutter anything sinister about her, and she would have gotten away with her crimes and sinful behavior had it not been that, quote, she herself, by God's mercy, conscience-stricken, made a confession about her wrongdoings, about her sorceries and abominable activities, and particularly about the death of the glorious King Edward, her stepson, whom she openly entrapped by her trickeries and unlawfully killed, so that her own son, Aelfthryth, should be raised to the throne. And with groans and trepidation, she revealed by what manner of death she had killed Byrhtnoth, Abbot of Ely.
How convenient. And is this confession mentioned by any other medieval author?
Apparently, the monks of Ely had kept that information to themselves until now.
Yeah, right. I remember that in the episode of our earlier talk, Martyrdom Most Foul, you said that you thought she might have had a hand to play in the killing.
Now, I wouldn't rule it out. The circumstantial evidence is pretty strong. King Edward's succession to the throne was contested, and after he beat out his younger half-brother, Ælfthryth lost her place at court and political clout. With her son the only possible heir to the childless king, Ælfthryth had motive. She also had opportunity. King Edward was murdered while on a visit to an estate that belonged to her and his half-brother, and it's possible that the men who actually killed the king were Ælfthryth's servants. What is certain is that the murderers were never publicly identified or punished, which implies that they had the protection of the new rulers of England, and those rulers were a regency made up of Queen Ælfthryth, her political supporter Ealdorman Ælfhere of Mercia, and Bishop Athelwold of Winchester. What is equally certain is that of the three, Ælfthryth was the one whom a later generation of ecclesiastical writers fingered as responsible for the murder. By the early 12th century, a tradition had arisen that she not only planned the killing but executed it. The ordinarily reliable Henry of Huntingdon wrote that he had heard that Ælfthryth personally stabbed her stepson to death while offering him a cup of wine. The author of the Liber Eliensis is simply piling on this by turning the pious Queen Ælfthryth into a witch and harlot, guilty not only of one martyrdom, but of perpetrating two.
Okay, why make her responsible for the murder of Abbot Byrhtnoth?
Now, a friend and sometime co-host, Dr. Jennifer Paxton, who's an expert on the Liber Eliensis, suggests that the abbey at this time was hurting for revenues and wanted to attract more pilgrims. The best way of doing that was to turn their first abbot into a martyr and a saint. If Byrhtnoth had died while at court, it would be natural to gin up a story in which Aelfthryth, the evil murderer of King Edward the Martyr, would have had the abbot killed under circumstances that would make him a martyr to the faith.
Then why did the author end his story by having Aelfthryth confess and repent all her sins and retire into a nunnery, which he founded to do penance? This is a surprisingly happy ending for a woman he portrayed as a harlot, witch, and murderer.
Now, I can only speculate about the reason, but Aelfthryth's confession was needed to answer your question, how the monks of Ely knew that their abbot had been martyred, and explained how and why a notorious wicked woman responsible for the death of a kinsman, a king, and an abbot could also have been a benefactor of their abbey. The author knew from the abbey's charters that Aelfthryth was both a donor to the church and a friend of Bishop Athelwold. He also knew that she founded the nunnery of Wherwell, where he supposed that she spent her last days, quote, in sorrow and penitence, close quote.
But is any of this consistent with what we know from other sources about Aelfthryth?
The last part is consistent, nothing else.
You mean that she died in the nunnery?
She died in the nunnery, and she was pious. She was the most fervent lay advocate for monastic reform, with the possible exception of her husband, King Edgar the Peacekeeper. Aelfthryth was either Edgar's second or third wife. Her father was the Ealdorman of Devon, and her mother belonged to the royal family. When Edgar married her, she was the young widow of Ealdorman Athelwold of East Anglia, the scion of one of the most powerful noble families in England. She was a well-connected woman. As Edgar's queen, she became a friend and ally of Bishop Athelwold of Winchester in his promotion of Benedictine monasticism. With her husband's approval, she ordered her household officers to drive out the secular clergy of the new Minster Winchester and replace them with monks. She was so great a supporter of Benedictine monasticism that Bishop Athelwold mentioned her by name in the preface to his Regularis Concordia. The Regularis Concordia, the common rule sanctioned by the Council of Winchester in 973 for all English Benedictine monasteries, is the most important document of the 10th century English Benedictine Reform movement. So it's really significant that Bishop Athelwold chose to name Queen Ælfthryth in its preface. The bishop wrote that King Edgar, having himself assumed the role of legal protector of the lands and rights of monasteries for men, quote, wisely ordained that his wife Queen Ælfthryth should defend communities of nuns like a fearless sentinel, so that naturally a man might aid men and a woman might aid women without a breath of scandal, end quote. She was to serve as the legal advocate for nuns and their houses, and to ensure that they adhered to the strictures of Benedictine monastic life.
But all of that was overshadowed by her possible complicity in the murder of Edward the Martyr. I mean, it seems unfair.
No argument from me about that. If Ælfthryth was complicit, she was one of many who thought the kingdom would be better off without the irascible and violent teenage Edward as king. Based on his actions during his brief reign, Edward was no more deserving of the title of Christian martyr than Ælfthryth deserved being called a harlot and a witch. Fortunately, enough contemporary evidence survives to counter the highly negative portrayal of Ælfthryth in later medieval sources. That isn't true, however, for either of our next two wicked women, Sibyl of Porcien and Mabel of Belleme.
The portrayal of Queen Ælfthryth as voraciously lustful and treacherous is straight out of the medieval misogyny handbook. Is that true for our second wicked woman, Sibyl of Porcien?
In spades, although she apparently only attempted to murder her stepson.
Well,
almost everything we know about Sibyl comes from an exceedingly biased source, Abbot Guibert of Nogent's memoirs. Guibert introduces Sibyl of Porcien, whom he never names. He just calls her the wife of. In this way, he tells us that she was the youngest child of Roger, Count of Porcien, by a second wife, a woman of common birth.
Which I guess he thought significant and maybe portentous for evil?
Yeah.
Okay.
Count Roger arranged that his daughter be married to a neighboring nobleman, Godfrey, and gave the county of Porcien as her dowry. That's a pretty good dowry.
Yeah.
While her husband, Count Godfrey, was off at war, his kinsman, Enguerrand de Beauvais, who lusted after the beautiful Sibyl, carried her off to his castle at Coucy. Guibert wasn't sure whether this was seduction or abduction, though he suspected the former. In his words, quote, "Her husband had been fulfilling his marriage debt far less than she would have liked."
How the hell would he know that?
I don't know.
You're right. I don't want to think about it. Go ahead.
Okay.
Keep quoting.
Whether or not this figured into her behavior, Guibert wrote, one thing is sure. She would never have gotten involved in such a monstrous public scandal had she not descended there one step at a time through clandestine acts of wickedness, especially considering that when she first came to her husband, she was already pregnant from intercourse with another man. Everyone is in such agreement about her past debaucheries that I'm ashamed to tell about them or even to remember them.
Doesn't seem to have slowed him down much.
No, too good a story.
Okay.
The result was a bloody war between the two men who claimed to be Sibyl's husbands. It ended up with Godfrey renouncing his marriage to Sibyl, but retaining half of her dowry.
This is starting to sound like a debased version of the Iliad.
Sibyl certainly is represented by Guibert as beautiful, and hers was a face that launched 1,000 sallies against castles, but she was even less faithful than Helen. 7 years later, she ceased having marital relations with Enguerrand. She pretended that this was for the sake of continence, that she had become pure and holy, but Guibert confides that the real reason was that she had become disgusted with her husband's weight and age.
Wait a minute. He's in a monastery. How the hell does he know any of this stuff?
Well, he knew that Enguerrand was really fat. That was common knowledge.
Okay.
Sibyl, however, couldn't do without a lover, and found a bright prospect in a young knight named Guy. Enguerrand tried and failed to prevent the affair. Rather than lose face with a public scandal, he invited the young man to join his household and betrothed him to their very young daughter so that his wife and her lover could meet in private. So yes, Sibyl is represented as a harlot.
Okay, so do we know anything about her story from any other source? Or her real story?
No. So we're going to have to tell the story from the viewpoint of Guibert. And this is the story that Guibert tells.
Okay.
And let me start with Guibert himself. Guibert is one of the shining lights of the first stage of the 12th century Renaissance, which was a revival of the study of Latin classical literature, rhetoric, and philosophy by churchmen. He was born in 1055 into a noble family of Clermont-en-Beauvaisis in northern France. Because of a distressed delivery, his father had made a vow to the Virgin Mary that if the child should survive, he would be dedicated to the church. Guibert survived, of course. His father, however, died 8 months after his birth. Guibert's pious mother refused to remarry despite being pressured by her late husband's kinsman, and she brought her son up alone. When Guibert was 6, his mother appointed a tutor who would educate the child for a career in the church. 6 years after that, she withdrew from the world to live a life of prayer in a house outside a monastery, the monastery of Saint-Germain-de-Fly, and Guibert's tutor became a monk of that house. The 12-year-old Guibert was left on his own, but when his mother received news about how he was being led astray by his cousins, she persuaded the abbot of Saint-Germain to allow the boy to live in the abbey and to continue his lessons with his tutor. Guibert's mother initially hoped that her son would become a secular cleric who might one day become a bishop, and Guibert took holy orders and became a priest. But he was drawn to the monastic life. As a monk of Saint-Germain, he gained a reputation for his mastery of Latin and his erudition, which led to his election as abbot of the small northern French abbey of Nogent in 1104. He composed for his monks a history of the First Crusade, which was based largely on an existing history of the Crusade written in much simpler Latin. More significantly, in 1115, he wrote an autobiography / local history, which he called the Monodii, or Solitary Songs. Historians tend to refer to this as the Memoirs of Guibert of Nogent. This is the first autobiography known to have been written in Western Europe since the Confessions of St. Augustine, composed 700 years earlier. Like Augustine's Confessions, Guibert's Solitary Songs is intended to be a work of spiritual guidance. Again, his audience was the monks of Nogent. Guibert presents himself as a youthful sitter who, through the guidance of his saintly mother and monastic discipline, learns to check his pride and devote himself humbly to God. The work is divided into 3 books. Only the first is really a memoir. The second concerns the history of the Abbey of Nogent and contains stories about good and bad monks. The third, which is the history of the See of Laon, is for historians the most interesting part of the Solitary Songs, in particular Guibert's dramatic account of the Commune of Laon, Bishop Gaudry's attempt to suppress it, and the rising of the town against its unworthy bishop, culminating in the killing of Gaudry. Sibyl of Porcien makes her appearance in Book 3. Guibert personally knew Sibyl. He knew her second husband, Enguerrand de Beauvais, Lord of Coucy, and he also knew Enguerrand's son, Thomas of Maule, and hated and despised them all. Guibert characterized Thomas of Maule as the worst man that he had ever known and substantiated that assertion with a series of atrocity stories.
I know I'm going to regret asking, but like what?
Yeah, I'm sure you're going to regret this. Rather than paraphrase, I'll quote. His cruelty surpassed anything that our times had ever heard of. In fact, some people with a reputation for cruelty seemed gentler in killing cattle than Thomas was in killing people. To force certain prisoners to pay ransom, he would hang them by their testicles, sometimes by his own hand, and often the body's weight would rip off the victim's parts and the guts would spill to the ground. End quote. That's only one of the many.
That was enough. I regret. Move along.
Okay, sorry. Guibert does seem to relish giving a litany of Thomas's cruel and inhuman acts. As I said, Guibert thought that Thomas was the worst man he had ever met. The main role Sibyl of Porcien plays in Guibert's account is as Thomas of Maule's rival and mortal enemy.
Given what Guibert says about Thomas of Maule, I would think that's a good thing.
It isn't.
Okay.
Guibert has nothing good to say about Sibyl. She's as promiscuous and cruel as her stepson. In Guibert's view, these two deserved each other, though God help all those who were collateral damage. Quote, I have never in my time seen 2 persons come together and by their common action produce so much evil. If Thomas was the fire, one might say his stepmother was the oil. Their morals were such that after indulging in their promiscuous sexual acts, they could still be just as cruel, even more so when the opportunity arose. Just as the laws of marriage never held her back, so also neither of Thomas's wives could ever deter him from consorting with prostitutes, end quote.
Well, at least Guibert here is slut-shaming a man as well as a woman.
Yeah, he was a monk after all.
Well, if Sibyl and Thomas were so alike, why were they enemies, and what did she hope to gain from ruining Thomas?
Sibyl's dispute with Thomas was over land and power.
Okay.
As the second wife of Thomas's father, Enguerrand de Beauvais, she was intent upon disinheriting her stepchildren, and in particular Thomas, whose power and ability she feared. To this end, she persuaded her husband to deny his parentage of Thomas, declaring him to be a bastard conceived through adultery. Given that father and son already hated each other, Enguerrand was more than willing to accede to his father's request.
From what you said, Sibyl's own marriage to Enguerrand was of doubtful legitimacy.
It was, at least to Guibert. To Guibert's disgust, Enguerrand...
Wait a minute. Well, he does seem to have been in a state of perpetual disgust.
Yeah, he is. He's either a disgust or self-loathing. That's his 2 go-to modes.
Actually, his main motive seems to be as a gossip.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing how he...
Why do you think we keep on reading this? It's because it's filled with really good gossipy stories.
Okay, never mind.
Anyway, to Guibert's disgust, Enguerrand was able to persuade his kinsman, the Bishop of Laon, also confusingly named Enguerrand, to annul his first marriage and sanction his union with Sibyl.
If Sibyl was refusing to have sex with Enguerrand, not the bishop, the husband, and was flaunting her affair with the young knight in front of him, why was he willing to disavow and disinherit his son Thomas on her behalf?
Guibert simply tells us that father and son passionately hated each other. The odd thing is Enguerrand and Thomas went on the First Crusade together.
These two robber barons were crusaders?
Yep, they were. Thomas of Maul apparently was one of the first men to enter Jerusalem during the siege of 1099.
This starts sounding like the knight who was with Joan of Arc and who turns out to have been...
Gilles de Rais.
Who was unutterably evil. Yeah,
the original for Bluebeard. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so Thomas of Maul is remembered as a hero in the Jerusalem cycle of crusading Jean-Jean's Jest.
Okay.
On the other hand, Abbot Guibert paints a similar portrait of him in his Life of King Louis the Fat.
Wait a minute. He called his book The Life of King Louis? Okay.
Louis was fat. I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's Louis VI, the King of France.
I assume this is after he was safely dead.
No, it's
not a big deal.
No, it's not a big deal.
Okay, go ahead.
It's in praise of Louis. Historians over the last generations have emphasized that the great attraction of crusading was not the prospect of wealth and land, but spiritual benefits and adventure. Thomas of Maul and Enguerrand de Beauvais were both in great need of remission of sins.
Okay.
Now back to the story. Sibyl was intent upon destroying Thomas, and Thomas was equally intent upon destroying her. He also wanted to destroy his father. In the words of Guibert, and I quote again, "Every day that vicious woman would devise new strategies to raise up enemies who could overthrow Thomas, and he in turn wasted no effort in using pillage, fire, and murder to even the score with Enguerrand."
It's interesting that this is gendered. Sibyl manipulates men to attack Thomas, but Thomas responds by himself waging war and murder.
Good point. Sibyl was intent upon killing her stepson. She had a supporter watch his movements and plan an ambush. The ambush nearly succeeded. Thomas fought his way out, but was riddled with wounds. He was carried back to the castle at Maul to convalesce. Now, one good ambush deserves another. And when Thomas, still convalescing, learned that Sibyl's brother, an archdeacon, was traveling to visit her, he had that party intercepted and had the cleric killed.
Wait a minute. Aren't clerics supposed to be civilians?
Yeah, they are. Exactly. Now, the archbishops and bishops of northern France had had enough. Thomas had murdered a cleric. He had supported the burghers of Laon after they had murdered their bishop, and he had seized a nunnery in Laon and all of its lands. This was the heyday of the peace and truce of God, which the church had devised to protect non-combatants, in particular churchmen, and their property. The northern French prelates met in council at Beauvais, excommunicated Thomas, and threatened King Louis VI with an interdict upon the royal domain unless he punished Thomas.
For the benefit of our non-Catholic listeners, an interdict is suspension of divine services. Basically, the bishops were threatening an ecclesiastical strike.
The bishops followed that up by preaching what amounted to a crusade against Thomas of Maul. They urged the common people to storm Thomas's council at Crécy as a form of penance for which they would receive forgiveness of sin.
This had to be drastic if they were encouraging the common people to take up arms. And we have a crusader becoming the target of a crusade.
You're right on both counts. With king, clergy, and the commoners united against him, and he himself still convalescing from his wounds, Thomas was compelled to seek peace and make amends. He paid a money ransom to King Louis, made reparation to the churches he destroyed, and returned ecclesiastical lands. In this way, he procured, in Guibert's words, quote, peace on one side and readmission of Holy Communion on the other. Guibert concludes his story with a moral, quote, thus the proudest and most wicked of men was punished by the hands of the poorest people whom he had so often punished and despised.
I don't know about that. He was on their side. He was on their side against the bishop. Never mind. Go ahead.
So that's the end of the story.
The end? That's all he had to do to appease the king and the church? He got to keep his lands? Did Enguerrand actually disinherit him?
He got to keep his lands. And no, Enguerrand didn't. I know, it's really odd, right?
Okay.
For the rest of Thomas's story, we have to turn to Abbot Suger's The Life of King Louis the Fat. Thomas continued to attack the lands of his neighbors in the church. He also seized merchants and held them for ransom. In 1130, the churchmen again had had enough and again called upon the king to punish him. Thomas this time was struck down in an ambush that backfired on Thomas. Thomas had tried to ambush King Louis. They figured out what he was doing, and they ambushed him instead.
He was trying to ambush the king?
Yes, he was.
Okay.
And ambushed him instead. He was mortally wounded. He was carried back to his castle, and he was allowed to have last rites. But here is the moral of the story. As the priests extended the consecrated host to Thomas's mouth, all of a sudden the host shrank back, and Thomas died without being shriven of his sins.
How dramatic. Okay, what happened to Sibyl?
She disappears completely from Guibert's memoirs along with Thomas of Maul, and she doesn't appear in any subsequent charters. We have no idea what happened to Sibyl.
Okay, it is an interesting story, but can we generalize from it about the status of women?
No, mostly what it tells us is about Guibert of Nogent's attitude towards women.
Okay.
And to appreciate exactly what it tells us, we have to place Sibyl in the context of the other women in Guibert's memoirs. Guibert's conception of women is conventional for a 12th century monk. It's essentially binary. There's the Virgin Mary, and there's Eve. Based on scripture, monks promoted the idea of a female spiritual hierarchy: the voluntary virgin, the faithful married mother, the chaste widow, and the harlot. The only perfect woman was, of course, Mary, virgin and mother of God, a literally impossible ideal. Eve was a more complicated figure. On the one hand, she was the first mother and wife, but on the other hand, she was the temptress through whom Adam and hence all mankind fell. Sibyl plays the role of Eve the temptress. As a sexual temptress, she is the cause of war, but she also has agency, manipulating males to carry out her nefarious plans. Opposed to her is Guibert's mother. He assures us that his mother was a great beauty, and as a young widow was most desirable.
He comments on his mother's beauty? Why?
He actually devotes an entire chapter to her beauty.
Ugh.
Guibert's emphasis upon the sexual desirability of his mother and the stories he tells featuring castration, yes, he does, we don't have to go into them,
Thank you.
seem to cry out for a Freudian reading, and two historians, Robert Benton and Jonathan Cantor, answered that call in 1976. The former did so tentatively. In the case of Jonathan Cantor, he did so enthusiastically. Most historians today view this as reductionist.
It's creepy either way.
Guibert emphasized his mother's physical beauty to make a point that his monks would appreciate. Poverty, like chastity, is a Christian virtue, but it's only a virtue if one embraces poverty from choice rather than to have to endure it out of necessity. The same thing with chastity. Guibert tells us that the beauty of his mother was checked by the severity of her countenance. Quote, the seriousness of her whole bearing was enough to show her contempt for all vanity, a sober look, measured word, modest facial expression hardly lent encouragement to the gaze of would-be suitors. End quote. Guibert adds that one rarely finds such self-control among women of her social rank. Her self-control was greatly tested, as her marriage to Guibert's father remained unconsummated for 7 years because of a curse placed upon the marriage by a kinswoman who wished Guibert's father to marry one of his nieces.
A curse? Now we have witchcraft?
Yes. When this became known, not the curse, but the non-consummation, the beautiful young wife came under siege, but withstood all temptation. This leads Guibert to ruminations about the state of women in his day. In earlier times, women's modesty was so great that no marriage was ever tarnished by public rumor.
Of course, that was before you had monks as gossipy as Guibert, but never mind.
Now, he wrote, among married women, the reality and even the appearance of reserve has disappeared in their conduct. They display nothing but coarse humor, nothing but jokes, winks of the eye, wagging of the tongue. They walk provocatively and show only silliness in their behavior. Their way of dressing couldn't be further removed from old-fashioned simplicity. Their broad sleeves, their skin-tight tunics, the curling toes of their cardigan shoes. In every detail they proclaim that they have cast all modesty to the winds. Any one of them would imagine she had reached the rock bottom of misery if she is presumed to be without a lover. Nobility and worldly glory are directly related to the number of suitors who follow in her footsteps.
Wait a minute. I thought he was a cloistered monk. Where would he see these women?
He could well imagine it.
Clearly, he could well imagine a lot.
He went out of his cloister. He was an abbot. I mean, he got around. Okay. So Guibert goes on and on about the shamelessness and corruption of the modern world. Sibyl may be egregious in her promiscuity and deceit, but she's more typical of the women of his age, according to Guibert, than his sainted mother.
Okay. Guibert certainly was familiar with the standard anti-feminist tropes of the literature of his age, but would you call him a misogynist?
Certainly by modern American standards. But Guibert is surprisingly nuanced when it comes to sex and even female sexual desire. His mother's glory is not that she lacks sexual desire. Her husband's failure to consummate the marriage is not a blessing, but is literally the result of a curse. It's more complicated than just simply saying he's misogynist. He's not completely against sex. He doesn't reject marital sex. Interestingly, he doesn't even condemn priests who are faithfully married, which warns us against exaggerating the influence of the Gregorian reform movement.
Okay.
Guibert praises his mother's chastity as a widow. Because she was young, beautiful, and rich, she attracted the attention of many young men, but she was able to control and resist her natural urges and turn them away, preferring the religious life. What makes her restraint the more impressive is that Guibert bought into the idea that women are more sexual than men. Sibyl exchanges spouses because her first husband can't fulfill the marital debt to her satisfaction. Earlier in the book, Guibert tells us about a tired old nobleman who escapes the sexual demands of an insatiable wife by retiring into a monastery.
Now that sounds like the type of joke a medieval monk would tell.
I'd like to think of it as a joke, but Guibert doesn't strike me as having much of a sense of humor. But to answer your question, I think that Guibert was more misanthrope than misogynist. Sibyl's wickedness is more than matched by Thomas of Malls. Guibert criticizes a number of men, including relatives as womanizers. A true misogynist would blame Sibyl entirely for Enguerrand's abduction of her from her first husband. He doesn't. Enguerrand in Guibert's eyes was as much a slut as was Sibyl, and for Guibert this was as much a matter of culture as biology. A theme of the memoirs seems to be that the world has gone to hell. Both women and men in his generation are worse than they were in earlier times. This was also true for monasticism, which is why reforming movements such as the Carthusians were so necessary and so rare. It's also why Guibert felt it his duty as an abbot to write a confessional as moral instruction for his young monks.
The thing I find most puzzling about Guibert's story about Sibyl is her husband's apparent indifference to her sexual affair with the younger man. He even enables it rather than face public humiliation. And that doesn't track with what we learned about marriage among the medieval nobility. Now, granted it was, almost 50 years ago, but I was taught that the key role played by women in medieval noble society was as wives and mothers, since the essential purpose of marriage was to produce heirs, preferably male, and perpetuate a noble bloodline through which the property would descend. And so marriages, children could be betrothed before they reached their teens, and noble marriages were more like corporate mergers than romantic unions. Love had nothing to do with it.
Once marriage was accepted as a sacrament in the 12th century, the voluntary consent of the couple became a requirement for a valid union. In theory, a girl could refuse her parents' choice of a husband for her. In practice, the preferences of the prospective bride and groom were subordinate to the designs of their respective families. which is eloquently expressed by Monty Python's Lord of Swamp Castle to his reluctant son, Prince Herbert.
Listen, lad, in 20 minutes you're getting married to a girl whose father owns the biggest tracts of open land in Britain.
But I don't want land.
Listen, Alice. Herbert. We live on a bloody swamp. We need all the land we can get.
But I don't like her.
Don't like her? What's wrong with her? She's beautiful, she's rich, she's got huge tracts of land.
I knew that you would slip in Monty Python somehow, but at least this is a good one.
Yeah, I couldn't have done this without your help, though.
Going back to our story, adultery is a huge threat, not only to the marriage, but to the entire lineage and to the entire clan to which you belong.
And you're absolutely right. It's also an insult to a nobleman's honor. In the case of Enguerrand, I think that really at that point, it may well be that his honor, his public honor, was more important to him than the possibility of his wife getting pregnant, especially since he did have a full-grown son.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah.
Okay. So basically, you see you see in the chansons and in chivalric stories where you have adulterous loves, but the most famous, Lancelot, Guinevere, whatever, but they don't exactly have happy endings.
No, they don't. They don't. And in the romances, what you have, especially romances, for example, like of the Trouvère Chrétien de Troyes, happy endings are reserved for knights errant who marry the beautiful and wealthy heiresses with whom they fall madly in love. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, the reality was a lot different than romances, and you didn't try to pretend to play the role of Lancelot or Tristan if you had any sense whatsoever and you were a household knight. One household knight who did try to do that, a household knight of Philip of Alsace, Count of Flanders, who was the patron of Chrétien de Troyes, one of the great patrons of chivalry. In his case, when he discovered that his wife Elizabeth was having an affair with that knight, he literally had that knight hunted down like he was going for a stag hunt. And when the knight was caught and savaged by the dogs, he had the knight beaten by the kitchen staff, and then had this knight hung upside down in the latrine until he smothered. Now, his wife, Elizabeth, was the daughter of the Count of Vermandois, and she brought with her a large dowry. He was not going to kill her, which would mean war with her family, nor was he going to repudiate her, which means that he would lose the dowry, but he beat the shit out of her. So,
okay.
The aristocratic male fear of being cuckolded was intensified by male assumptions about female sexuality. In the literature of the High and Late Middle Ages, women are represented as sexually insatiable.
I've noticed that women rather than men seem to be the sexual aggressors in medieval romances like Chrétien de Troyes' Perceval. Knights errant always seem to be fending off offers from the damsels they rescue.
And from the married women that they rescue as well. But thank you for giving me another excuse to play a Monty Python clip. This one celebrates.
What have I done?
No, this is great. This is Galahad's perilous adventure at Castle Anthrax.
So naughty person, and you must pay the penalty. And here in Castle Anthrax, we have but one punishment for setting alight the Grail-shaped beacon. You must tie her down on a bed and spank her. You must spank her well, and after you have spanked her, you may deal with her as you like, and then spank me. And spank me? And me? And me? Yes, you must give us all a good spanking. And after the spanking, the oral sex.
Well, I could stay a bit longer. Oh, hello. Quick, what? Quick, why? You're in great peril. Go on. Silence, foul temptress. Look, you've got the point. Come on, we will cover your escape. Look, I'm fine. Come on. Look, I can tackle this lot single-handed.
Yes, let me tackle the single hand. Yes,
No, together. Come. No, really, honestly, I can cope. I can handle this lot easily.
yes, let him handle these.
Sweet, I can defeat them. There's only 150 of them.
Yes, you'll beat us easily. We have it to charm.
Okay.
Romance writers and the kings, counts, and barons who were their patrons were as suspicious and wary of female sexualities as were the Christian clergy.
Then how do you explain the exalted position women seem to have had in the love poetry of troubadours in medieval romances?
I'm not sure how exalted it is to be an object rather than the subject of love.
Oh, good point.
The main function of women in medieval romances and chansons de geste is to be objects. They're the objects through which a knight could demonstrate courtliness, and they were the reason that he would perform chivalric deeds.
Okay, we're running out of time, so let's turn to our third wicked woman, Mabel of Belleme.
Why don't I tell our listeners about the monk who loathed Mabel of Belleme, Orderic Vitalis? Then you can tell them about Mabel. Orderic Vitalis was the son of a French priest, Odolarius of Orleans, who was a chaplain in the household of Roger II of Montgomery, a powerful Norman noble, and the husband of Mabel of Belleme. Odolarius accompanied Roger Montgomery to England, was given a church in Shrewsbury, and married an Englishwoman. Yes, I know I said that the church had forbidden clerics from marrying, but England in the 1070s was a bit behind the times. Orderic Vitalis was their eldest son. Like Guibert, Orderic was entrusted at the age of 5 to a learned priest for instruction. 5 years later, his father sent him as an oblate to the monastery of Saint-Evroul in southwestern Normandy. There he became first a deacon and then a priest, and spent the rest of his life as a cloistered monk. He never became prior or abbot. His major contribution to the monastery was literary. Around 1115, the abbot of Saint-Evroul ordered Orderic to write a history of the abbey. Orderic responded by spending the next quarter century writing what he entitled the Historia Ecclesiastica, the ecclesiastical history. The title probably is borrowed from Bede. The Historia Ecclesiastica began as a history of the abbey, but expanded in scope to become a religious and political history of Normandy and Norman England. The story of Mabel of Belleme appears in Book 4.
Mabel's father, William of Belleme, William Talvis, which means shield, was a marcher lord and a violent and dangerous man. And Orderic tells us that William's first wife was too devout and too prissy, and that Mabel's father had her mother assassinated and then married somebody else. He also tells us that her father dealt with the rival family, the Girours, who were the founders and supporters of the Abbey of Saint-Evroul, by having what sounds an awful lot like the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. There was a big wedding banquet. William Giroux was rash enough to come to the banquet, where he was captured, blinded, mutilated, and the House of Giroux was never the same after that.
And it established a long-lasting feud between the House of Belleme and the House of Giroux.
And so what we have is Orderic trying to walk a really interesting line. You see, what happened is William Talvis, the father, basically had to flee after this atrocity. And when he was fleeing, he had his daughter, Mabel, and he married her off to the heir of the Montgomerys, which gave the Bellemes a really important protector. And it's interesting that he was able to do that, and that Mabel inherited the lands of the Bellemes, even though she had two brothers. One of them was a knight, and he seems to have, okay, fine, I'm a knight, at least the Bellemes, at least nobody's going to murder me because the Bellemes have a powerful protector, and the other son was illegitimate. But Mabel became the de facto head of the House of Belleme, and she acted like it. She and her husband seem to have operated very successfully in tandem. They both were supporters of the Dukes of Normandy, who had not yet established firm control over Normandy, never mind anything in England. Fascinating thing about Mabel of Belleme is that her career is during the transition to the High Middle Ages.
Yes.
Now, her lands in Belleme were in the southeast of Normandy.
Yeah, they're marchlands. They're on the border.
Yeah, yes. It's like a marcher border society where royal or ducal authority is far away.
Yes.
And you have families that are battling with one another, not just for prestige, but for land and power.
and in some cases, survival.
What you see here is not the High Middle Ages as such. What you see is the generation or two of the High Middle Ages becoming established. A woman named Cressida Jacobs, who had devoted her PhD thesis to Mabel of Belleme in 2019, cites of all people Frederick Turner for the frontier in American history in trying to talk about the wars between these noble clans and how they explain the career of Mabel of Belleme. He's writing it to justify the existence of Saint Evrule.
We said before that the main duty of a noble wife was to have a son, to have children, to perpetuate the lineage.
She and her husband had 10 children, including a son whom Orderic describes as almost as violent and evil as his mother and his grandfather.
The notorious Robert of Belleme, who apparently could have given Thomas of Maul a run for his money. Orderic Vitalis, in Book 11 of his Historia Ecclesiastica, calls Robert, quote, grasping and cruel, an implacable persecutor of the Church of God and the poor, unequaled for his iniquity in the whole Christian era, end quote. Then again, Orderic never met Thomas of Maul.
But she was clearly operating as the head of a noble house. She herself founded monasteries. She also was a friend and supporter of the previous abbot of Saint Evrule, which is kind of hard for Orderic to rationalize with the story that he wants to tell about her.
So how does Orderic actually characterize Mabel of Belleme?
And let me just quote, this Mabel, whom I mentioned, was a forceful and worldly woman, cunning, garrulous, and extremely cruel. But she had a great respect for the man of God, Thierry, and though she was merciless to other men of religion, she sometimes listened to him. Close quote. Now, Orderic claims that when she went to visit the abbey, she brought too many knights with her, which was a cost to the abbey. And when she was reproached for that, she said, I'll come whenever I want, and I'll bring as many knights as I want, and stomped off in a huff. But then Orderic tells us a very strange story. Orderic says that as she was riding away, her breasts became very painful, and she stopped and found a child who was nursing and had the child nursed from her breast, which relieved the pain, and then she rode on, and then the child died.
Yeah.
Now, it sounds as though she was breastfeeding one of the 10 children and had been way too long and was having a lot of pain from the backed up milk. Why this random child happened to die, we don't know. But Orderic sees it as almost as a message from God about how evil she is.
That she herself is poisonous and the mother's milk that she has is pure poison.
He also tells us, interestingly enough, that she accidentally poisoned the brother of her husband, Roger of Montgomery, and the brother's companion. I personally find this very hard.
Because she was trying to kill one of the Joie.
Yes. Now, I find this very hard to understand. There are a couple of possibilities. Now, we notice that Orderic never criticizes Montgomery. One of the reasons I think Mabel appears in such a negative light is because she has to carry all the water, even though the two of them were basically one consolidated house.
Yeah, I can see that.
I find it hard to understand why Roger of Montgomery would let the murder of his brother slide. Unless, of course, he was a border lord like the rest of these people and, losing the younger brother was a good thing. But which, again, Orderic goes out of his way not to say anything about.
Orderic seems to blow off that Mabel actually founded abbeys.
He seems to be pissed off that she founded abbeys instead of simply favoring his abbey and making it richer. I'm not sure how that makes her an evil person.
She does come to a very bad end.
That's true. She had been involved in a series of violent property disputes with a family that wasn't as powerful as the Bellemes and was taking over their land. And 3 of them actually broke into the castle where she was staying. She had just finished taking a bath, and she was going from the bathhouse to her bedroom, and they murdered her, and then rode away.
They chopped off her head.
That's true.
I mean, that's a really dramatic murder.
But what's interesting about this is that, well, it's very interesting all by itself. But what's also interesting is, if you notice, the men who murdered her were universally denounced. The Duke of Normandy threw them out. They wound up going to Sicily and from there to Jerusalem. And we actually have the epitaph of Mabel who died when she was about 50, and as I say, left 10 children behind. And I'll quote it as now. Sprung from the noble and the brave, here Mabel finds a narrow grave. But above all women's glory fills a page in famous story, commanding, eloquent and wise, and prompt to daring enterprise. Though slight in form, her soul was great, and proudly swelling in her state. Rich dress and pomp and retinue lent it their grace and honors due. The border's guard, the country's shield. Her father, Talvas, meaning shield.
Yeah.
Both love and fear her might revealed, till Hugh revengeful gained her bower in dark December's midnight hour, then saw the Diva's overflowing stream, the ruthless murderer's poignard gleam. Now friends some moments kindly spare, for her soul's rest to breathe a prayer. Now this sounds as though whoever put up this epitaph, which would be her family, maybe even her husband, saw her acting in much the same way as a male border lord in these turbulent times. Is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay. Now, Orderic, of course, says, well, that's only because she was rich and powerful that they chose to
honor her with that.
Yeah, but I do think that this doesn't fit in any attempt to put it into simple sexism.
It does if the sexism is that Orderic Vitalis was disapproving of Mabel because she was a woman who acted like a man, a virago, and that made her unnatural. And that's what previous generations of medieval historians have said about her.
Well, they did, but I think I think that's an oversimplification, if not actually wrong. Orderic writes about a number of other powerful women who maintained and defended their lands, mostly in the absence of their husbands. He praises William the Conqueror's wife Matilda, who acted as regent for his Duchy of Normandy while he was in England. There's Adele of Blois, daughter of William the Conqueror and wife of Count Stephen, who was active, at least as politically active as Mabel, and was one of Orderic's heroes. Virago isn't necessarily meant as an insult. When you're talking about a woman, it can be, wow, she rises to the level of a man.
Yes.
When required to rise to the occasion, her nobility of blood enables her to arise to the nobility of behavior of a man.
It's part of the reevaluation of the agency of noblewomen.
That's true.
In the politics of the period. And that's one of the great major changes in the historiography of the period over the last few decades.
Especially in terms of women.
Yeah, when we were undergraduates, and when you were undergraduate at Byrhtnoth under Susan Wemple, Susan Wemple had helped reshape the history of women by saying that Frankish women had power.
Yes.
Frankish women were able to behave with the same authority as males. But she then would go on to say that in the 11th and 12th century, these women lost the power to exercise political economic authority because of the transformation of the aristocratic family into a patrilineage in which the eldest son inherited virtually the whole patrimony.
It's interesting.
But that's not seen to be true anymore.
One of the great services of Suzanne Wemple and Joanne McNamara and her generation was actually to go back to the primary sources and read them critically and see what women were actually doing, as opposed to how their actions were being characterized.
And that's the problem, is that earlier generations of historians had an assumption that the reason they didn't write about women, the reason that they ignored women, was because the women didn't appear in the sources. The problem is they didn't look.
Or they certainly didn't look enough. But I also think that with Wemple and with McNamara, one of the things that happened as you move from this transition period into the High Middle Ages is a consolidation of political power. When people like Mabel of Belleme and Sibyl were active, the writ of the King of France didn't run that far. The Dukes of Normandy varied enormously in how much control they actually had over Normandy. And, Mabel and the Bellemes were on the borderlands. And the royal authority or ducal authority was far away. And I think that part of what happened in the High Middle Ages is not just that, the Mabels and the Sibyls, had their wings clipped and could no longer exercise authority. If I should have said this before, Mabel of Belleme left a son.
Yeah, Robert of Belleme.
Who tried to behave in as violent and reckless a way as his mother and grandfather, in attacking other nobles, trying to, take over other territories. And he eventually lost everything. And you stop hearing about the Bellemes at all. To the extent they survive, it's because Mabel and Roger Montgomery had a lot of daughters who married very well. But I think that in addition to the women, I would almost say border reivers of 10th and 11th century Normandy, losing their autonomy and their ability to, attack each other, the men did too.
Many historians in the 1970s and 1980s believe that the process you just described is the reason that women in the High Middle Ages lost the political and economic power they had enjoyed in earlier centuries. Georges Duby, the most prominent French medieval historian of the late 20th century, claimed that French noble families in the 12th century responded to the concentration of power in the hands of kings, dukes, and counts, and the threat it offered to their own power by adopting the practice of primogeniture. Women's rights to inheritance were restricted in favor of a single male heir. This was justified by the male aristocracy's self-definition as a military caste. If the only heir to a noble estate was female, her husband would exercise authority over her lands. If she was unmarried, her lord chose her husband, a right that was used to reward the faithful service of knights and to create political alliances. The main, if not sole, role of women in noble society was now to produce a male heir. To protect the purity of the bloodline, wives and daughters were confined to the inner chambers of castles, from which they were trotted out for display on ceremonial occasions. In this way, Duby claimed, women were excluded from the exercise of public authority.
I found Duby's brief biography of Eleanor of Aquitaine maddeningly condescending. He turns her into a complete cipher. He dismissed contemporary and posthumous accounts of her as a political actor as ideological and misogynistic literary fictions. The only power, quote-unquote, that Eleanor or any of her female contemporaries had in this age of men, according to Duby, came through exploiting their feminine wiles. In his words, quote, "The nature of women made them unsuitable to the exercise of public power. Some, nevertheless, managed to snatch a few crumbs, but discreetly, and by exploiting their feminine resources. When they were young, they played on the desire that the sight and the touch of their body aroused in the bodies of men, that of their husband and those of the knights of their court. In old age, they relied on the tender regard of their sons." Close quote. Duby apparently didn't realize how misogynistic his own assumptions about women were.
This isn't what most medieval historians now think. One of the hardest things to wrap one's mind around is that history changes. This doesn't mean that the past changes. What was, was. But what we know about the past, the questions we think to ask about it, and how we interpret evidence changes generation to generation. The lack of evidence for women's activities in the Middle Ages was an assumption rather than a fact. It was repeated so often that there was no need to challenge it by actually doing research. That changed in the 1970s and 1980s. While Susan Wemple revolutionized our understanding of Frankish women, Theodore Evergates, Kimberly LaPrette, Amy Livingston, Heather Tanner, and Frederick Chayette overturned Duby's pessimistic view of the women in aristocratic society of the High Middle Ages. They demonstrated that noble women, even those below the rank of queen and countess, continued to exercise power and hold land, although the extent of their legal power varied by region. Noble women, particularly widows and women whose husbands were off on crusade or simply away from home, served as the lords of their estates and bore the responsibility of defending their property and fulfilling military obligations upon it. Upon inheriting property, a female heir was required to perform homage and swear fealty to a lord just as a male would. That was equally true for widows on receiving dower lands. Orderic Vitalis had no problem with good wives protecting their family lands, or even women wearing armor riding among the knights. He writes admiringly of Sibyl, wife of Robert Baudet, Lord of Tarragona, quote, "She was as brave as she was beautiful. During her husband's absence, she kept sleepless watch. Every night she put on her hauberk, a coat of mail, like a knight, and carried a rod in her hand, mounted in the battlements, patrolled the circuits of the walls, and kept the guards on the alert for the enemy's stratagems." He wrote of another noblewoman, Isabel, the wife of Ralph of Conche, Quote, Isabel was generous, daring, and light-hearted, and therefore lovable and estimable to all around her. In war she rode armed as a knight among the knights, and showed no less courage among the knights in hauberks and sergeants at arms than did the maid Camilla among the troops of Taurus.
Okay, maybe we should have an episode on medieval women knights.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. We shouldn't get carried away. For the most part, warfare was considered the province of men, and women who fought in armor were enough of an anomaly to warrant comment by chroniclers.
Yeah, and those chroniclers were men. Female authors whose works have survived are just about as rare as women warriors. There are few female voices in the medieval sources that are not mediated through men.
As a generalization, men were responsible for the public sphere, women for the domestic sphere. But because the boundary between private and public was fuzzy and fluid in medieval society,
and especially in this early transition period,
noble women exercised authority and power. They brought with them into their marriages dowries that often consisted of large tracts of lands. As widows, they acted as the sole lords of their dower lands. Medieval society was traditional not only in assigning of gender roles, but in its rigid social hierarchy. What makes it particularly difficult to generalize about women in the Middle Ages is that noble women had much more in common with men of their class than they did with peasant women. The domestic, quote-unquote, domestic functions of the lady of a court included dispensing patronage and gifts, receiving guests, supervising the upbringing of children, and helping to arrange marriages.
You know, sometimes the personal is political, and that was especially true then. And which brings us back to Mabel of Belleme. She was a powerful noblewoman in the southern and eastern borderlands of Normandy. She and her husband, Roger of Montgomery, were among the more successful predators in the turbulent and chaotic world of 11th century Normandy. And Mabel took an active role in this and was as much a robber baron as her husband.
But if other contemporary noble women could act politically without incurring Orderic Vitalis' disapproval, what's so special about Mabel?
Well, two things. Orderic distinguished between wives who gave good advice to their husbands and tempered their aggressive disposition. Mabel, in his opinion, was a bad influence on her husband, Roger II of Montgomery, and an even worse one upon their son, Robert de Belleme, who exercised a reputation for cruelty and viciousness worthy of his mother and grandfather. The second reason was personal or institutional. Mabel's family was engaged in a feud with the Geroy family, and the Geroy family were the founders and patrons of Orderic's Abbey.
So Orderic loathed Mabel not because she was a virago, not because she was a woman acting like a man, or even because of her aggressive acts upon the properties of her neighbors, but because of a feud between her family and the family of the patrons of the abbey.
Orderic also focused his criticism on Mabel and her son rather than Mabel's husband, because the Bellemes had fallen, but the Montgomerys were still powerful.
We really have run out of time. I would love to be able to sum up this episode with some pithy generalizations, but the cases of these three so-called wicked women make it difficult. Medieval male misogyny was real and did influence the portrayal of all three women, but it doesn't sufficiently explain why they, in particular, were singled out by the monastic authors for trashing. In each case, the monastic author used the woman for his larger narrative purposes. The author of the Liber Eliensis inherited an image of Queen Ælfthryth as a wicked woman who had murdered her stepson, King Edward the Martyr. He expanded on this image to make her into the instrument for a second martyrdom, that of the first Abbot of Ely, probably in an attempt to increase the attraction of the abbey for pilgrims. He then had this wicked woman confess so that he could square the circle and acknowledge her also as a benefactor of the abbey and a woman who had died as a nun. Guibert of Nogent knew, or at least had met, Sibyl of Porcien. For Guibert, Sibyl was a key player in a story of three bad people doing very bad things to one another, with a lot of innocent people as collateral damage. But Guibert also used Sibyl's wickedness to highlight the goodness of his sainted mother. Both women were beautiful and desired, but unlike Guibert's saintly mother, Sibyl gave into her lusts and used her feminine wiles to free herself from a lukewarm marriage and then engineer the destruction of her even more wicked stepson. And Mabel of Belleme was trashed by Orderic Vitalis because he was writing a history of his abbey of Saint-Avold for his fellow monks, and Mabel and her family were feuding with the founding family of the abbey.
Nothing is simple in the study of medieval history.
In the study of history in general, nothing's simple. But if it was, it wouldn't be as challenging or as interesting. I hope that you will be able to join us for our next episode that answers the question, was King Aelfthryth really unready? I will have as my special guest and co-host Dr. Levi Roach of Exeter University in the UK, who I would say is the man who knows more about King Aelfthryth than anybody else in the world. I hope you'll be able to join us. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please let friends know about it. And if you are listening to it on Apple Podcasts and have the time and inclination, please vote and review it. Until next time, bye for now.